We're going to begin a new series this morning. Yes, you. And I know what you're thinking. Preacher, you just started a new series last week. I did. And in total transparency, that one really needs to stay in the oven and cook a while longer. I about put my own self to sleep last Sunday. So we're going to start something new. A new series called Yes, You. If I told you that God can use you for great things, that He has a plan for you and wants to include you in accomplishing His purposes, I know most of us are kind of humble enough that our first question would be, who, me? And I'd say, yes, you. You say, I'm not qualified, I'm not strong enough, I'm not well known, I'm not a good enough speaker, I'm not smart enough, my history is too bad. And I'll remind you that God can use even you. Yes, you. We're going to take about 4 weeks to look at the lives of a few unlikely people whom God used to do amazing things. We're going to learn from the least likely to succeed, from the outsider, from the guy who stands behind the scenes, and from the underdog. This morning, we meet the least likely to succeed. You know how in high school, in your senior year, they choose those superlatives, those class favorites, right? You may have somebody who was the most popular. Somebody's the most athletic, most likely to succeed, the cutest couple. My brother was elected the most scholarly male in his class. I was elected most likely to win the lottery and lose the ticket. Can you imagine being elected or chosen as the least likely to succeed in your class? What might that do to a person? That their peers assume that they are the least likely to succeed in life. That's exactly what happened to Jack. That's what his classmates thought of him when he graduated from Ottawa Hills High School in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1951. His classmates declared him the least likely to succeed. Understandably, he was a C student, giving it mediocre attention at best. He did just enough to get by and did not like school and didn't care about education. However, there was a principal who moved in while he was there, and that principal took a special interest in him, encouraged him, motivated him, so that Jack wound up going on to college, and after college he began his career, and eventually Jack Clifford created the Food Network. Today, that multimillionaire returns to his old high school every year to provide $10,000 in scholarships for students who might otherwise be overlooked. This morning I want to introduce you to one who was the least likely to succeed and yet wound up doing some amazing things for God. I want to direct your attention to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And while you're looking for that, let me give you just a little bit of background. In chapter 16, the prophet, also a judge, he was the only one who was both, but the prophet Samuel hears from God, go to Bethlehem. And when you get to Bethlehem, find Jesse. And in Jesse's family, you will find the next king of Israel. So far, Israel had only had one king, King Saul, and he was not a great king. Because he wasn't much of a king, it was time for his reign to come to an end. And so God was ready to find the next king. He sent the prophet to Jesse's house. Samuel found Jesse's house and said, "Jesse, God says that one of your sons is going to be the next king. Let me meet your sons so that I can anoint the right one." Jesse brought in Eliab, the biggest, the brightest, the oldest, the firstborn, the obvious choice. He came in and he was tall, he was good looking, he was sharp, he was athletic, he was clearly a leader. Just looking at him, people would say, "I'll follow you wherever you lead." He was the most likely to succeed. Samuel said in his heart, "This one must be the right one." But God spoke to Samuel and said, "This is not him." In chapter 16 at verse 7, God said, "For the Lord sees not as man sees." Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. In other words, God said, "I've seen this guy's heart, and he's not it." So they went to the next one, the second born, and brought him in, and he looked good, but God said no. They went to the third one, and they brought him in. He looked good, but God said no. They brought him in another one and another one. 7 guys come in before the prophet, and each one God says no, no, no. Finally, Samuel says to Jesse, "Well, you've been through all your kids in the house, and none of them are the right one, and yet God sent me to this house. There's got to be something going on. Don't you have any other sons?" And he didn't say this in Scripture, but I think in my imagination, he basically said, "Well, not really. The only one left is the little one, the kid, the runt. He's the youngest." Now, he should have known if he was the youngest, he would be the best, but that's okay. He's the youngest. He's the runt. We don't even include him in whatever we got going on. Do you notice that? They got something going on in the house. All the brothers are there except this one. The least likely. All we let him do is keep the critters out in the backyard. Samuel said, "Bring him in." They brought in that runt of the family, the last-born, the smallest. Bible says he was ruddy, which means he was red. Might mean he had red hair, but I think it probably means he had a red tone to his skin because he was outside all the time. Whatever it means, that he was a little dude, he was ruddy. They brought him in. Samuel saw him and said, "This is the man." Anointed him that he would one day become king. The least likely to succeed. We fast forward to chapter 17, and you have found verse 4 by now. And what's happening is you've got the Philistines on one side of a valley and the Israelites on the other side of a valley. That was often the way that war was waged in that day. You wanted to get the high ground. The high ground was of great value and strategic planning. And so the Israelites were on one side and the Philistines on the other. Once you have kind of a high ground, you don't ever want to give it up. And so the challenge was that if you're on one side of the valley, in order to attack the enemy, you'd have to give up some of your ground and you'd have to take a chance. And then you're coming uphill. Uphill climbs are harder than going downhill. So whichever one decided to take the initiative, they were going to have to take a chance in there. And because of that, they both just stood there yelling at each other for a while. We're badder, we're bigger, we got you, we're not scared of you, blah, blah, blah. And then, as you know the story, the giant Goliath came out of the Philistines. Look at verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. I want you to notice as we begin the story together, look at the challenge to faith. Goliath represented a great challenge to the faith of the people of God. And as he comes out, it says, what did it say? He's 6 cubits and a span. If you translate that into our measurements and you kind of do the numbers, that means that he was about 9 feet 5 inches tall. That's one big dude. I just recently learned of a man named Robert Wadlow. Robert Wadlow, born in 1918, was the tallest man on record. He was measured at 8 foot 11 inches. So, yes, Goliath was bigger than Robert Wadlow. He was taller. No doubt he was an intimidating presence, all 9 feet of him. Have you ever noticed that they just don't make giants like they used to? The tallest man in NBA history was a large man, but at just 7 foot 7 inches, he would be no match for Goliath, who had 17 inches on the tallest man in NBA history. Since most door jambs are 6 foot 8 inches tall, the top of the door jamb would have hit him about chest high. He was 6 cubits and a span, 9 feet 5 inches, give or take. Look at verse 5. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Translate that to 125 pounds that he wore. He had a bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head weighed 600 shekels. That's 15 pounds. That's just the tip, just the head of the spear, 15 pounds. And his shield bearer went before him. Now think about that poor dude. That would have to be one big shield. And he had some little dude walking in front of him carrying that thing. This was a huge individual, a challenge to their faith. Every morning and evening for 40 days, Goliath paralyzed the armies of God with fear. He stood there taunting them and making fun of their God, and in fear of that great challenge, they stood still and quiet. But notice then the perspective of faith. The challenge of faith is this great giant, but notice with me the perspective of faith. Jump down to verse 24. I want you to see the perspective that comes from faith. Verse 24. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. But then jump down 2 more verses to verse 26. And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" You see, Jesse had sent David to the front lines to bring food to the brothers who were fighting. And when David got there, he said, "Guys, what are you doing? You're standing around smacking your gums instead of fighting these people. These people are offending God. This loudmouth big one, he's saying for 40 days he's making fun of our God. How can you stand there?" And they said, "Yeah, don't know what we can do." And David said, "Well, I know what we can do, because you're seeing a giant, but I'm trusting in God. Men say, look at how much bigger he is than us. But David was saying, look how much smaller he is than our God." David had no armor, no experience, no equipment. He was not battle tested, nor was he trained. But he knew something that Goliath didn't know. He knew that no matter how big the giant is, God is bigger. Those of you who have been with us for over a decade, remember how we too learned that God is bigger than anything we have to face. David got it. He had the perspective of faith. While in 24, the soldiers looked at the giant and ran. In 26, David looked at the giant and said, "Who does he think he is to talk about our God that way?" He had a perspective of faith. And then hear the testimony of faith. The people hear David talking, and so they go to King Saul and they say, "Hey, this little kid over here, he's talking big." And so Saul brings in David, says, "What's going on, David?" David said, "I can take him. I can take him." Look at verse 33. Saul said to David, we're in verse 33, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he's been a man of war from his youth." David was the least likely to succeed. On the field that day were men who had armor, men who had weapons, men who had training, men who had knowledge and experience. They should have fought the enemy. David was nothing more than a little runt who keeps the critters outside, who had been sent on an errand to bring the Lunchables. The least likely. And the king says, "You're nothing but a youth. You're just a kid." But David in verse 34 said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and I struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them." Why? Look, "For he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Bless your heart." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." He said, "I know that I can handle it because I've seen what God can do." When the bear attacked, God handled it. He helped me take care of the bear. When the lion attacked, God handled it. He helped me take care of the lion. This Philistine, he's nothing to my God. How do I know? Because I've lived it. I've seen it. This is the testimony of faith. The Lord did it in the past, so I know He can do it again. Many years ago, a ship was being tossed around in a bad storm. A man was frightened, but he saw this little boy who just looked calm. He's just riding out the waves and hanging out in the storm. The man asked the little boy, "How can you be so calm in this awful storm?" The boy answered, "Because my daddy is the captain, and he has never lost a ship at sea." Friends, how do you know that God will bring you a victory today? You know that He'll bring you a victory today because He brought you a victory yesterday. How do you know you can face the giant tomorrow? Because of what you've already faced last week, last year. Our problem is sometimes we have spiritual amnesia. And we forget that God has proven Himself over and over and over. And so the next time we wind up in a valley facing an enemy, we have to remember God has brought me through so much already. I know He's got this. It's a testimony of faith, which leads to the confidence of faith. The confidence of faith. Look at verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor. He tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. I love that. He tried in vain to go. The reason that's funny, the Bible tells us that Saul was a tall dude. It said that he stood a head above everybody else. So, you go to a party and you look around and there's that one dude over on the other side of the room and you can see him above the crowd. You see his head above the crowd. This is Saul. He's tall. That means that his armor, his outfit, was not just a normal outfit. It was one of those that you buy at one of those tall and big men's stores, right? It was extra long, extra tall. And so now here you got little David. And he's not only going to put on a grown man's outfit, but he's going to put on a tall grown man's outfit. You ever see those? I just love those pictures where you put that little 2-year-old in her daddy's boots, I love those pictures. That's Daniel. That's David. That's David. He's got all this stuff on, and it says here, 39, he tried in vain to go. He couldn't take a step. He couldn't handle it. And so it says because he hadn't tried them on before, he hadn't tested them, he didn't know how to do this. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, put them in the shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. He went back to being himself. See, everybody around him said, you're least likely to succeed, so let me tell you how you're supposed to do this. Let me make you like me so you can be more likely to succeed. And David said, your stuff don't fit me because God made me me. He didn't make me you. And so he said, I'm going to take what I'm used to, what I am. And he picks up the stick of the shepherd boy and the sling of the shepherd boy, and he goes out with confidence. I love that at the end of verse 40. He with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. Earlier, we saw that the others were running away from the giant, and here is David approaching with confidence. Later, David would write in Psalm 20 and verse 7. He would, let me see if I can find that, 20 and 7. David wrote, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. The armor wouldn't fit. He couldn't carry the sword, but he learned that he could trust in the name of the Lord our God. That's because he not only had the confidence of faith, he had the focus of faith. Look at the focus of faith. Beginning of verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air, to the wild beasts, to the earth, to all the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Do you notice the focus of faith? Over and over he says, you're coming at me with armor and a sword, but I'm coming in the name of the Lord. You see, David knew that he was no match for the giant in his own strength, but he also knew that he didn't face the giant in his own strength. He knew that this was the Lord's battle and not really his own. David learned something that some of us need to learn, and that is, it's not about you. David didn't go in to be the hero. He went in to serve an almighty God, and he could look Goliath square in the face and say, my God is bigger and badder than you, and my God is going to get you today because you've defied him. You see, it was all about Yahweh. It was about the Lord. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 4, we're reminded, little children, you are from God and have overcome them, for he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. David could stare down Goliath because he knew it wasn't about David. He didn't set out to do a great thing for God. Now understand this, because we don't always tell the story this way. David did not set out to do a great thing for God. He just gave God what little he had and trusted God to work through him. That's how victories in the valley are won. When we are in the valley, most of the time, we are not called to do great things to impress God. When we're in the valley, instead, we're called to say to God, here's what I've got. I've got a stick and a sling. That's all I got. God, you take over. You win the battle, and you get the glory. That's how victories in the valley are won. Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 10. Do I have that? Isaiah 41 and 10. Y'all look that up sometime. Max Lucado says, focus on giants and you stumble. Focus on God, your giants tumble. The family knew that David was the least likely to succeed. The Israelites knew that David was the least likely to succeed. Goliath knew that David was the least likely to succeed. Saul knew David was the least likely to succeed. Even David knew he was the least likely to succeed, but he knew something the others didn't. He knew that what was about to happen wasn't about him. He knew that God can make a way where there is no way. He knew that Almighty God was bigger than any giant. He knew that the Lord of hosts was going to fight the battle that day. He knew that one faithful believer and God make a majority. He knew he wasn't likely to succeed, but he knew the Lord of Israel would not fail. That's the result of faith. Look with me at the result of faith very quickly in verse 48. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Again, Paul says in Romans chapter 8 that in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Friends, David is not the hero of the story because of his power, his strength, his courage, or even his aim. He is the hero of the story because he was willing to be used by God to accomplish God's purpose and fulfill God's plan. We tell the story of David and Goliath because the one who was the least likely to succeed said yes. The one who didn't have a chance took a stand. The one who was too little to be considered stood tall. The boy with a slingshot proved himself to be a man of God whose greatest weapon was faith in the living God. The boy whose family didn't believe in him faced the giant without them, but he did not face the giant alone. David was the least likely to succeed. He was not a soldier, he was a shepherd. When others see a little shepherd boy, God might see a king. Regardless of how others see you or how you see yourself, God can use you to accomplish amazing things. I hear you asking, who, me? And my answer is a resounding yes, you.